an interesting topic. The genocide of the indigenous peoples of Brazil in the context of the civil military dictatorship, the community responsibility during genocide. They are to be presented by Ligia de Souza Cerqueira, Layla Suma, and Stephanie Havir. So Ligia Cerqueira has a Bachelor in Law by Mackenzie Presbyterian University, postgraduate degree in human rights from the Catholic University of Portugal, an advanced training course in penal execution by the Ibero-American Institute of Legal Studies. Then the Stephanie Havir is a master's degree candidate. She has a Bachelor in Law at Mackenzie Presbyterian University and Languages and Literature by Sao Paulo University at London. So Layla Soma is a PhD student at Graz College and is the Education Director for the Center for Genocide Research and Education. And is a postgraduate student at Criminal Law by Ebradi and Bachelor's Law in 2021 by Mackenzie Presbyterian University. So please help me to welcome our presenters.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for having us. It's a pleasure to be here. Before starting the presentation, we would like to point out that the indigenous tribes affect in the context of the civil business military dictatorship will not be individualized one by one, either due to the precariousness of the data available all the time or due to the time limitations. Therefore, considering the preliminary survey of data indicates about 8,300 indigenous people were killed in the context of the civil business military dictatorship, we will refer to the ethnic group in general, but respect each tribe and culture individually. The implementation of the Brazilian military dictatorship took place on March 31st, 1964, as a result of a political articulation between parts of the business community, the press, the middle class, and the United States, which dissatisfied with the illegal communications of the President João Goulart, carry out, among other measures, the active sponsorship of two conservative political groups, the Institute of Research and Social Studies, responsible for funding an anti-communist propaganda campaign, funding anti-government public demonstrations and supporting, including financially opposition or far right groups and associations, and the Brazilian Institute of Democratic Action, which, after receiving millions of dollars from US, made donations to political campaigns of conservative candidates in order to create a front of strong opposition to the Goulart administration, a type of donation that at the time was considered illegal by the Brazilian legislation. So considering the economic support of Brazilian business groups and part of our middle class, some scholars choose to call the period a civil business military dictatorship, while other scholars prefer to call it just a military dictatorship, without considering the active role of these actors. In the beginning of the anti-democratic regime, which lasted between 1964 and 1985, several administration measures considered progressive and necessary for a fast development of the country were instituted in a period that became known as the Brazilian economic miracle. At the time, large investments were made in works in the areas of transport, energy, and military strategy, such as the Trans-Amazonic Highway in the state of the Amazon, in the Amazon forest, and the Tucuruí, Balbina, and Itaipu hydroelectric. To make the dictator regime's projects viable, the government acts were edicts such as the National Integration Plan, which promoted a proposal for regional development in the north and northeast of the country, to its lower population density and consequent economic power, building highways without considering the existence of 29 indigenous groups, which 11 were completely isolated. To carry out the project, the National Indigenous Foundation signed an agreement for the pacification of 30 remote indigenous groups and became the executor of a policy of contact, attraction, and removal of indigenous from their own territories in favor of roads and intended colonization, which contaminates the native peoples with disease, which they did not have antibodies and therefore caused mortality. Furthermore, faced with the need to cut the jungle with a road and in order to free up indigenous lands to enable the implementation of agro-industrial projects, the military determined the forced march of the natives, dozens of days or months into the bush without access to water and food, which harmed their health and caused several cases of desnutrition, leading them to death. At the same time, the government allowed the mapping of protected indigenous areas and the start of mining in the Amazon forest, in territory where the Yanomami people live and where one of the tribes who live on the Catrimani River were decimated by 50 due to the flu and disease. As part of the policy of genocide against and the indigenous peoples who live in the areas, choosing to be a stronghold of development in the country, the pacification sponsored by National Indigenous Foundation caused 5 compulsory transfers between 1971 and 1977, in addition to the death of 180 indigenous people, equivalent to 59% of the original population, due to the epidemic disease brought by National Indigenous Foundation's workers. The forced transfer in 1970 of 700 indigenous people from the Paracana people, 4 of whom died of a flu infection through contact with the white man, and in 1975, a vaccination campaign for the Yanomami people that should last 3 weeks, but was reduced to 2.5 days. Stephanie?
Oh, hi, I'm sorry. I would like to talk to you a little bit about a document called the Figueiredo Report, which is barely known by the Brazilian population, which is very unfortunate. And it contains, let me begin again from the start. The Figueiredo Report was developed during the military dictatorship by the order of the Ministry of Security. And this public prosecutor called Jader Figueiredo, which is the name of the report, he traveled through zones, how can I say, these zones were under government regulation, and he discovered that these national indigenous organisms were not promoting the pacification per se of the indigenous people. Rather, they were spoiling their lands and their assets and committing gross and massive human rights violations under the military dictatorship. But nevertheless, this report did not aim to investigate the human rights violations. It rather aimed to investigate corruption scandals inside government organisms. And therefore, it is not very detailed about the violations of human rights of indigenous people, but rather about the corruption scandals committed by the military dictatorship. And this report was it was believed that this report was destroyed by fire at some time in the past, but 40 years later, only in 2013, this report was found, and it really affirms that really serious and gross violations were committed by the military dictatorship, such as murder, torture, rape of women, and they inoculated smallpox to a specific tribe in order to kill that tribe and get their lands and distribute to government officials. And they also donated sugar with strychnine poison in order to kill the population, and etc., etc. Very gross human rights violations that were never prosecuted. No one was held accountable. And actually, in 2011, a National Truth Commission was created in order to investigate all human rights violations committed by the military dictatorship. Nevertheless, no one was actually punished by that. There are some few civil proceedings regarding reparations, monetary reparations to victims, but none regarding indigenous peoples. And this Truth Commission actually found out that about 8,000 indigenous people were killed by the military dictatorship, but thinking that the Figueiredo report was only found in 2013, we believe that this number is much larger than 8,000 people. And the sad part is Brazilians don't have knowledge of these things, and even there are some people that don't believe that the military dictatorship occurred. They say it was just some not a dictatorship, but some military took the power only to rebuild the country and to make it beautiful and economically thrive. But actually, those horrors occurred under the orders of the military dictatorship, and this information is not disseminated through Brazilians. But we do have strong evidence that genocide was on course in Brazil, and we need to investigate and declare that to the Brazilian and people and to the world. And now I would like to thank you for the opportunity and give the floor to my colleague Layla to conclude some of our investigations.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Layla Summer, and the explanation given by my colleagues demonstrate the violent and genocide nature of the acts committed against many indigenous tribes during the military dictatorship. Therefore, I would like to conclude our presentation by demonstrating the actus rea and mens rea of the parties involved, in particular the government organization FUNAI, which was supposed to protect the indigenous people. The Article 2 of the Genocide Convention lists an exhaustive list of acts that constitute the crime of genocide. In this case, the actus rea is fulfilled by killing members of the group. It is clear that many indigenous people of different tribes were killed by agents of FUNAI. They use different tools to achieve that, such as manhunting, such as drop dynamite from planes, and also they cause body or mental harm to members of the group. So as such, torture, rape, and prostitution of Indigenous women, and as my colleague said, the donation of sugar with poison. So, and they intentionally inflicted on the group condition of life, calculated to bring physical destruction of the group in whole or in part. So FUNAI intentionally brought disease as chickenpox. They reduced the campaign vaccination that was supposed to last 3 weeks to only 2 days. And they did not protect the tribes against the pollution of the surrounding environment. There was a lot of pollution because of the gold hunters that were there. So that's Cactus Rea. The mens rea is a little harder to prove, but not impossible, because even that the Figueiredo report wasn't made to investigate criminal responsibility, we can still have to prove that the violence that happens against Indigenous people was of common knowledge to everyone that worked at FUNAI, and it was a plan. Therefore, we like to conclude that the crime of genocide was committed against several tribes during those years. After the return of democracy in the 80s, the life of Indigenous people improved. However, there is not until today any criminal responsibility or memory for the victims. Therefore, there's no education about genocide in Brazil, the genocide that has occurred. And it's our opinion that because we don't have any criminal responsibility, memory, or education about these facts, it still happens today. So in 2023, unfortunately, the Yanomami tribe, we have some signs that has been a genocide with this tribe. They have been suffering from malaria, from COVID. They don't have enough food or means to get food because gold hunters are living in their land and polluting rivers and all the animals. So they are dying, and the situation is very bad in Brazil. And we believe that it is very bad because we did not handle things very well in the past. So now the past still continues to happen in the present. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Ligia de Souza, Cerqueira, Layla Suma, and Stephanie Havir. The work you are doing is extremely important. It reminds me of your famous countryman, Paulo Freire, of the pedagogy of the oppressed. So we can only say, keep doing what you are doing, and the world is hearing what you're doing. And we can only say we are happy that you guys, made a great choice in electing Lula, and hopefully you will pay attention to what you're saying. I don't know, perhaps we have questions. And by the way, we have at least up to 40 people taking part in online virtual. So if you have questions, please, we still have at least a few minutes for questions. Yes, Dr. Raglan has a question. Could you give the microphone to him?
Thank you so much for your talk and your research. And I was curious, during after 2014 and 2015, there was a lot of organizing in Brazil around Black Lives Matter, for instance. And I'm curious if there's been any reparations organizing that's taken hold in Brazil. I spent some time in Brazil, and I know that after enslavement, the government destroyed all the records. But I mean, I'm just curious, Brazil has had this long history of one of the most brutal periods of enslavement than any country. And if there's movement around that around lifting up those historical injustices as kind of precursors for some of the political violence that intermittently, like, you know, and also curious about what Bolsonaro's since he's trying now, or what he's, you know, doing since Lula was reelected.
Ligia, would you like to take this one? Because
No, you can.
okay, so thank you so much for your question. Unfortunately, in Brazil, people are not that empathic with those questions, especially regarding indigenous people. We do have, since Lula was reelected, we do have a growing movement towards indigenous people's human rights and to prosecute, maybe prosecute some of the violations committed by the agribusiness and how can I say garimpeiro? I don't know this word in English, I'm sorry.
Gold hunters, I believe.
Yeah, thank you. So we are discovering now that the previous government allowed several garimpeiros to go to the Amazon and invade the lands and illegally take gold and resources from indigenous people's lands. And this inflicted several rights violations to those people, including this malaria outbreak right now, and COVID outbreak, and the lack of vaccines, lack of food, the pollution of the rivers, and actually the killing of the deliberate killing of indigenous people. So Lula government is trying to investigate and to work on that question. But you said some interesting thing about the enslavement in Brazil. Just to give you a fun fact, some schools in Brazil teach, mine was one of them, they teach children that enslavement of indigenous people was not successful because indigenous people are lazy. That's the reason they give us. It's not true, obviously. It's because they don't have this pattern of thinking that you have to produce and gain money, etc., etc. They live harmoniously with the environment, and so they don't have this logic of predatory exploitation of the environment. So unfortunately, education in Brazil is a matter. It's a concern. We don't have many academics talking about it, and unfortunately that's the scenario here. But we hopefully we are trying to change that through research and through these academic exposes, and that's it. Thank you so much.
I would like to say that Brazil is, we had one of the most long enslavement. Brazil and Cuba were the last countries to enslavement. And in Brazil, I think not the only, but good thing that the government did about 20, 30 years ago was affirmative actions for Black people and Indigenous people to be able to go to college just as white people. So I think that's something that we are working towards, good education for all Brazilians so that, genocides won't happen again. So we're just trying. Thank you.
Yeah, and we were the last country to abolish slavery in the continent. So that says a lot about our background. And I'm not sure who made this question. It's Jody?
Yes, Jody.
Okay, because I saw your question on the chat and about the picture. It was a prison for indigenous people, and it was built during the dictatorship, and they used torture. Torture took place in an attempt to reintegrate the prisoners into Brazilian society as a way of erasing their culture and the way of life.
Yeah, I mean, my question, and that would be similar to residential schools, say in Canada, and what's beginning to be called Indian schools in the US. But my question was, as I looked at that photograph, it seemed to me that the two men guarding them were of African descent. And so what I was asking about is, have you looked at the instrumentalizing, let's say, of Black Brazilians to do the dirty work of killing, torturing, and dispossessing Indigenous Brazilians by white Brazilians or other Brazilians with a lot of wealth and privilege?
Yes, those guys are Black men. And Antonio Cotrim was not a Black man; he was a white man, and he worked on FUNAI that used to. It was built to protect the indigenous people. But while the dictatorship was working, FUNAI was used to took indigenous to their lands. So Antonio Cotrim, he quit the FUNAI administration. He said he could not look to the indigenous people being murdered again. So he's not a Black man, but the guys who that was working and the indigenous prison used to be the Black man.
All right. Thank you very much. About the issue, whether it's a Black man or a white man or a red man, we want to stop violence. And that's the beauty of the work you are doing. So a very short question because we are running out of time. And could you please switch the microphone back to... Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question. I was just thinking about new thinking in the last decade or so, in the last 10 years or longer, about the rights of nature, including respecting the rights of not only the land and plants, but also animals. And in this new thinking, I was wondering if there is some movement in Brazil about that encompasses not only the rights of nature, this new movement or thinking, but also the human rights of indigenous people, of all the people.
Thank you for your question. Yes, actually, we have some legislation about environmental law and the protection of the environment, especially regarding native, how can I say, native lands like the Amazon and the Cerrado, which is a bioma, natural resources place. We do have some law regarding the protection of those places, and a part of that, we have some legislation about indigenous people. But unfortunately, that's the question. Brazil is a very large country, and we don't have, we do have the legislation, but that doesn't mean it is actually applied everywhere in Brazil. So in the Amazon, for instance, we have many places that we don't have easy access because of the lands and the rivers, etc. So there's no one to see if the legislation is actually being applied over there. But We do have the judicial system, but it doesn't work as it should. But we are also working on that to improve.
Thank you very much. We don't have any more questions, do we? Okay, so could you please help me to thank our presenters now? Thank you very much. We hope that one day you will join us here. We look forward to greeting you here because the work you're doing is just very phenomenal and very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. All right, so we have now time for